you probably thought we were going to talk about the eclipse. Why in the world am I talking about slavery in the Bible? Is the slavery that's talked about in the Bible, because you can find it in both the Old and New Testaments. You don't see any legal postulating on it in the New Testament, but there's a lot about it according to the law in the Old. Is it the same as was practiced in early America? And why look at this anyway? If it's Old Testament and it's history, why look at it? And the reason is because there are a lot of people who are looking into the Bible and looking for ways to detract from the Bible. And they say that if God included slavery in the practice of his people, that the Bible must not be any good and God must be evil. But if you look at slavery in its context, in its historical context, it was genius. And if you look at it this way, it dispels all these objections to it. But first, let's look at 3 quotes from 3 of our founding fathers. This is George Washington. I can only say that there's not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery. George Washington, of course, the first president of the United States. Thomas Jefferson, our 3rd president, said the abolition of domestic slavery is the greatest object of desire in these colonies, where it was unhappily introduced in their infant state. That's Thomas Jefferson. James Monroe, 5th president of the United States. We've found that this evil, slavery, has preyed upon the very vitals of the Union and has been prejudicial to all the states in which it has existed. James Monroe. Now consider the context of biblical slavery and its differences from the worst examples of slavery in this country in its inception. You remember all the horrible things we see about slavery in this country and the way it was practiced then. And not all slave owners were evil, hard, terrible masters, but enough of them were, plenty of them were, that it was a horrible thing for those who suffered under it. They were treated worse than a lot of cattle. As a matter of fact, you wouldn't do the things to any of your stock, your livestock, that were done to a lot of people in the name of slavery. But in 1500 BC, in the world of the Bible, it was difficult and it was dangerous. If you had nothing, slavery was a good option. The prodigal son of Luke 15:11-24 gives us a perspective into this reality. You remember what the prodigal son said to himself when he was feeding the hogs? That's what he had come to. And he said, aha, I know what I'll do. I'll go back to my father's house and I'll ask to be a slave. And at least then I'll have something to eat and I'll have a place to stay. And I don't know if he didn't mention it in that context, but one of the things that would have been of concern to people in the biblical days was security. If you and I have trouble, we get on the phone, we call 911, the police show up, an ambulance shows up, firemen show up. You didn't have anything like that in the days of the Bible. All you had was your family, people you worked with, people you had relationships with. And those were the people you looked to for your protection and for your security. And if you were on your own, you didn't have any of that. But if you were a slave, you had that. So what did God's law stipulate for slavery? Let's look at Exodus 21, 1-6 first of all. And please open your own Bibles and look at these texts from your own Bibles. First of all, Israelites could be purchased as slaves. They served 6 years, and they were then set free. If a master provided a wife for one of his slaves, then that wife, as well as any children from the marriage, were retained by the master when the father was set free. By the way, I should say, try to look at this with biblical eyes rather than the eyes of 21st century Western people, because that's what we typically do, and we make a mistake when we do that. A slave may choose to remain with his master if he wanted to. And consider the realities. If you had nothing, here's what slavery would do for you. It would provide you with a place to live and food to eat. If you were poor, you were destitute, there was no welfare. You couldn't go down and sign up for the WIC program. You couldn't call in When I was growing up, it was called Health, Education, and Welfare, ATW. Now it's called what? Okay, yeah. So there's a name for it, and we know there's people to call. There wasn't anybody to call in that day. What are you going to do when you don't have anything? If you were a slave, you would have a place to live, and you'd have food to eat. You would have security from poverty, because you wouldn't be absolutely in destitute poverty. You would have clothing. You would have a place to stay. You would have food to eat, and you would also have security from danger, as we mentioned before. Remember the guy, the Good Samaritan helped? He was on the road by himself. He was put upon by bad guys and left for dead. That's how he was found. You would have training in some skill or skills. Excuse me. I'm just going through puberty, that's all. A couple years I'll be through it and I'll be okay. What's that? You listen to both of me. Anybody remember that episode of the Brady Bunch where one of the kids was going through slavery and they made up a song so that as he was singing the note it would break in range? Anyway, that's not me. That's not me. But if you were a slave and you signed on to work with somebody, you would undoubtedly learn some kind of a skill. There was something that you would be given work to do, and you would learn that work. And remember, how long did you serve as a slave before you were let go? 6 years. 6 years. So by the end of 6 years, do you think whatever you'd been given to do for those 6 years, you would be competent at that? And you would be able to say, I'm going to go over to so-and-so next door, and I'm going to sign on with him, and I'm going to work as a hired man doing the same thing I've been doing for this guy for a slave. Or you might like your master well enough to say, this is a good master. I think I'll stay with him and keep doing this. Who knows? You remember when Sodom and Gomorrah was attacked prior to their being destroyed by God? But Sodom and Gomorrah was attacked by the Cheese Federation. I call it the Cheese Federation because the king who led them was called Cheddar Lomer. Anyway, him and a bunch of other kings attacked Sodom and Gomorrah. They took all the people captive. Who saved them? Abraham saved them. How did he save them? He had 318 men in his house who had been trained, and undoubtedly trained in war. And those guys were faithful to Abraham. They were faithful enough to say, yeah, let's go to war for Abraham, our master. And they took off. They did combat with the bad guys. They defeated them. They shredded the cheese king, and they brought all the people back. So you're going to get trained to do something. If your master has any sense at all, he's going to put you to work, and you're going to learn to do something. You would also have your eventual freedom, and you wouldn't simply be set free, but the master was obligated when he set you free to give you generously and liberally from his wealth. And so you would be sent out with a grubstake after you had fulfilled your obligation as a slave. Let's look at Exodus 21, verses 7 to 11. A man may sell his daughter into slavery. And you might ask, as I would ask when I first read this, why in the world would a guy sell his daughter into slavery? What if you're poor and you can't afford to provide for your daughter? Sell her into slavery. Might there be other reasons? Sure. But whatever the reasons may have been, God provides that you could sell your daughter into slavery. She's not to go free when the time comes, as the male slaves are set free, and God doesn't specify why that is so. I might speculate myself. I might say, well, she's a girl, and it wouldn't be safe for her to be out on her own. But later on, in a certain situation, we'll see where a young woman would be given her freedom. Her master may allow her to be redeemed. Redemption was when somebody, primarily a family member, would come and say, I don't want her to live as a slave anymore. I want her to come stay with me, or I want her to be my slave, and so I will redeem her and ask her to come and serve with me. And you would pay the price that was right for her, and she would get her freedom from that master. She may not be sold to aliens. It's an interesting thing about Israelite slave laws, that as God gave them to Israel, there wasn't in this big slave trade. It was not a commercial enterprise. You don't kidnap people. You kidnap people, you die. That's not what slavery was about, as it was practiced in this country. Very different. She can't be sold to aliens. If she's going to be sold, she has to be sold to other Israelites. Continued, same text. If she's designated for his son, in other words, a father sees a young lady who would make a good wife, he thinks, So he would buy her if she's available to be bought, and he would buy her for his son. And if he does that, he has to treat her as a daughter. She's no longer simply a slave, but she is now his daughter. If he takes another wife for himself, in other words, if he got her for himself, remember they practiced polygamy in those days, and concubinage. Not saying it was good or it was right, but it was practiced. We know that it was. If he takes on another wife for himself, then her rights cannot be diminished either materially or conjugally. He's got to provide for her as he provided before. He's got to pay attention to her as he paid attention to her before. If he refuses her provisions, she is to go free without having to make redemption. In other words, she doesn't have to buy her freedom now. If he's not going to provide for her the way he's supposed to as a husband, he has to set her free. Exodus 21 also teaches, verse 16, human trafficking is strictly forbidden. No slave trade, no commerce. You don't go out and kidnap people. You don't go out and grab people in the dark and bring them in and sell them as slaves. That's not the way this was supposed to work. This was for poor Israelites. Verses 20 to 21, killing a slave. If you killed a slave in this country in 1850, what would happen to you? Nothing. You kill a slave under the law, you die. You don't take other human life where you die. Chapter 21, verse 12 spells that out. However, it's interesting, if the slave did not die from whatever you did to him, then no vengeance will be taken. 26 to 27, injuring a slave's eye or knocking out his tooth was to result in his freedom. You hurt him in the eye, he can't see in that eye, then you got to set him free. You knock out a tooth, you got to set him free. Leviticus 25. A poor Israelite, now this is not a slave in this case, this is just a poor Israelite. You got a poor brother living among you. He's to be sustained charitably like a stranger or a sojourner. Isn't that interesting? Like a stranger or a sojourner. God specified in the law that if there was a poor stranger, a poor alien, a poor sojourner among the Israelites were to treat him with generosity and kindness. That was the law. No advantage was to be taken over him whatsoever. Now, let's stop for just a minute and look all together at chapter 22 of Exodus, verses 21 to 24. This tells us something of the mindset of God, and any Israelite familiar with this text would know what God was expecting as far as the relationships between people, whether they were master, slave, or whatever. Exodus chapter 22, verses 21 to 24. You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not afflict any widow or orphan. If you afflict him at all, and if he does cry out to me, I will surely hear his cry. And my anger will be kindled, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. Now, I know verse 21 talks about the stranger and the strangers in the land, and then it talks about the widows and the orphans. But I wonder why he talked about the strangers, and then just went immediately to widows and orphans. And specifically for widows and orphans, he said, you give them a hard time, I'm coming after you. It seems to me that in the mind of God, he would have put those together because he has that kind of an attitude also towards the aliens and the strangers. Do not oppress a stranger. Do not oppress a widow. Do not oppress an orphan. Do not oppress a slave. A poor Israelite may sell himself as a slave to another Israelite. Here's what I see in these two situations. You're a poor Israelite, and you're trying to make it on your own, and you want to make it on your own, and so your fellow Israelites are supposed to help you financially as they can. But if you say, man, I'm still not making it. I just can't do it. Will you buy me and let me live in your house, under your roof, in your compound, as it were, among your other slaves? Will you do that for me? And so you sell yourself to him so that you will have a living. You've got a place to stay now. You're going to have guaranteed food. You're going to have clothing to wear. You're going to have work to do. These are the kinds of things that God was providing for with this system of slavery. If this happens, that poor Israelite who sells himself to you has to be treated as a hired man. He will serve only until the Jubilee. Now, the Jubilees is a separate issue, but you can read about it in the first part of chapter 25. Every 50th year was the Jubilee year, and all debts were forgiven. All slaves were set free. If somebody had sold himself to you, then on the Jubilee year, it's your obligation to turn him loose, and you turn him loose with a grub stake. It's really a great system if you stop and think about it. And all you need to add to this is a godly spirit in the mind of those who would have been the masters. And that godly spirit in the masters should have been reciprocated by a godly spirit in the minds of the slaves. And if everybody's got a godly spirit, everything's going to work out fine. Everybody's going to have a place to stay. Everybody's going to have work to do. Everybody's going to have food to eat. Everybody's going to be taken care of. The crops are going to get planted. The crops are going to get harvested. The cattle are going to be cared for. Everybody's going to have something to do. And just like it says in the New Testament, if a man doesn't work, neither should he eat. This was a provision whereby everybody could work and everybody could eat and everybody could enjoy the safety and security that they needed. This individual is never to be sold if he sold himself to you as a slave because he was poor, and he is never to be ruled over with severity. How much better, I should say, would it have been if that one passage would have been applied in early American systems of slavery? Don't rule over him with severity. I'm not saying that would have made it fine. I'm just saying it would have improved it greatly. Leviticus 25. Verses 44 to 46, slaves may be acquired from pagan nations around Israel, as well as from the aliens living among Israel. Now, that doesn't mean they can be acquired by going over there in the middle of the night and grabbing a bunch of them. That just means you've got people living across the border. He's got a guy, he's really good with camels. You don't have a guy that's really good with camels. What are you going to do? You're going to go talk to Abdullah over there. Hey, what do you take for that slave? And you might even get him for 6 months or a year. I don't know how it all worked, but you could acquire him as your slave, and then he would work for you. You see how this would work and this would be efficient? If we're looking through this simply through the eyes of what slavery was like in this country, then no, that's a horrible filter to use. But if we're looking at it through the eyes that God provides us in Scripture, of a historical context where life was hard, and if you didn't have anything, it was tough. And here's a way you could have something. Here's a way you could learn a skill. Here's a way you could be put to work, and everything would be good for everyone. These slaves that you acquire from the pagan nations, they could be male, they could be female, they may become possessions. And this in no way diminishes their humanity. It simply means, all right, now you are obligated to me. You are obligated to this family. As Americans, what do we think when we see this? They weren't Americans. You know that, don't you? They were human beings who needed to eat and live securely, and this provided for that. And today, if you can't create a business, if you don't have the knack to build wealth, and a lot of us don't, then you could find somebody who did have a knack for business, who did have a knack for wealth, or who had inherited wealth and was able to use that wealth, then you could sign on with them and be successful. And isn't that what we do today? Don't we, when we graduate high school or college, we go look for a job. Well, who do we want to work for? We want to work for somebody who's successful. We want to work for a company that's going to pay us well. We want to work for a company that's got good benefits. This was the same thing. It just wasn't 21st century America. They may also be bequeathed as permanent slaves. You might be in somebody's will. He's going to give you to his son when he passes on. Leviticus 25 continued. Israelites may even sell themselves to aliens within Israel with certain caveats. Here are these two. You've always got the right of redemption. If somebody else in your family wants to buy you out of that servanthood, that slavery, then they can buy you out. And you've always got the right for that. Or if you make enough money in the course of your service, isn't that interesting? Oh, a slave might make enough money in the course of his service? Yeah. To buy himself out, because that's the way slavery worked. Exodus 22:3, I just wanted to throw this in there. Here's another way people could become a slave. If you're a thief and you're caught stealing, what did the law say you were to do as restitution? You pay back 4 times as much as what you had stolen. If you can't pay it back, oh well, I guess you'll have to be sold so that your debt can be paid, and now you're going to be working for somebody. What is it that Paul wrote to the church at Ephesus? Let him that stole steal no more, but let him work with his hands. To what end? That he might have to give to those who are without. It's the same thing throughout the Scriptures. Don't be a thief. Israelite slaves were to be set free after 6 years. This is from Deuteronomy 15, verses 12 to 15 and verse 18. They're to be set free having been furnished liberally from the wealth of their master. And the masters, this is God talking to the masters. He says, you masters, you're going to set these slaves free. You remember what it was like when you were a slave. And you remember how I redeemed you from that bondage. And when you came out of Egypt, do you remember what God had the Egyptians to do for the Israelites? They loaded them up. They came out of Egypt, not in poverty. They came out of Egypt with much of the wealth of Egypt. And God says, this is what I want you to do. You're a master. You've got a slave. His time is up and he wants to move on. You give him liberally from what you have so that when he goes out with a grub stake and he can get started on his own. And God says, if you're generous towards your slaves, guess what? I'm going to shower you with blessings. This is the law. Deuteronomy 15, verses 16 to 17, right there in that same text. Slaves who want to stay with the household rather than go free may do so. This guy's been your master for a long time. He's a good master. You like working with him. The master shall use an awl to pierce the ear of the slave at the door of the house. We don't sing that song here, do we? I mean, it's not like we've decided not to sing. How many of you know there is a song, Pierce My Ear? Yeah, okay, the young people know it then. Pierce my ear, O Lord, this day. It's all about this text. You've been a slave. And we think, ooh, slave, I'd never want to be a slave. Well, you work for somebody, don't you? If you really like, what if you loved the company you work for now? And you went to your boss and said, you know, I want to make sure I never get fired. You said, well, okay, come over here at the door. I'll get the stapler. Ka-chunk. Okay, you're with us forever now. That's essentially what this was. And how many people live in fear that they might lose their job or get fired? And God is saying, if you are a good servant and you like your master and your master likes you, this can be a permanent relationship. And why would you not want that if you are putting yourself historically in that situation? Am I done? Is that the last? Oh, that's the last one. All right. What time is it? Okay, I'll see you at Brahms. No, I'll come back just briefly to say again why I put this lesson together. I was challenged in a discussion about the Bible, and somebody said, oh, God is evil, the Bible is evil, the Bible's got slavery in it. We all know how evil slavery is. And I thought, well, okay, that's a statement that bears some investigation. And so I started looking into the biblical slavery, and this is what I found. And when you put it in its context, it makes all the difference in the world. Now, if you want people to continue thinking, well, God approves of what happened in this country prior to the Civil War, that's not what the Bible is saying at all. Not at all. And if we can go ourselves and make this kind of a study and say, okay, that's not what it says, then when somebody says that to you, oh, the Bible's got slavery, so I'm not going to believe in the Bible. It's going to be interesting to me on the Judgment Day. I don't know how it's going to go, but all of us have some ideas of how we think it might go and what might happen. And I can just imagine God bringing people up before him and them say, well, we thought you were evil because you had slavery in the Bible. And just listening to God say, did you read that part? Well, no, it was about slavery. Did you read what I wrote about slavery? Did you read my stipulations about slavery? No, well, it's about slavery. Well, now you're a slave for eternity. Slave to your own ignorance, a slave to your own prejudice, a slave to your own bias. At any rate, when somebody says something to you about the Bible and accuses God of being unfair, Find out where they're getting it from. Go to that part of the Scripture and read it for yourself, and you'll find out every single time, as I have every single time, you look at it in context, there's nothing to it. Amen? All right. What are we called over and over and over again in the New Testament? With slaves of the Lord. Do we want him to pierce our ear? Yeah, amen. I don't want to ever stop being his servant. I want him to be my master forever and ever and ever, just like the song says. So tonight, if you are not a slave of God, if you're not one of his children, we want to invite you to take advantage of the water that we've got behind here. We can lower you into that, and in so doing, you'll go into the burial of Christ, dying to sin, raising to walk in newness of life. If you have other needs for which we can pray for you, we're asking you to let us know about those as well. So let's stand and sing the invitation song for anybody who would like to respond.